The horse had gone down just after noon, not dramatically, no stumble, no cry. Copper had simply stopped walking, stood in the snow for a long moment, like he was thinking something over, and then folded. Cade had barely gotten his leg clear in time. He'd crouched there beside the animal in the blinding white, one hand pressed against Copper's neck, feeling the warmth drain out fast. "Damn it," he said. That was all. There wasn't much more to say. He'd pulled what he needed from the saddlebags, a bedroll, a half-empty canteen that was already beginning to ice at the lip, his rifle, and a canvas pouch containing exactly 4 strips of dried venison he'd been rationing since Tuesday. He left the rest. Weight was the enemy now. Distance was the only thing that mattered. That had been 6 hours ago. Now the sun was dropping behind the Bitterroot Range, and the temperature was doing what Montana temperatures do after dark in January, falling off a cliff. Cade kept his head down and his legs moving, following what might have been a trail or might have been nothing but wind-carved shadows in the drifts. He'd lost Hollis Vane's tracks somewhere around midday, right when the sky opened up and the new snow came down thick and sideways. Hollis Vane. 3 bank robberies across 2 territories. 2 men dead, one a deputy barely old enough to shave. The circuit judge in Billings had posted a $200 reward, which was the kind of money that made reasonable men do unreasonable things. Cade had been chasing Vane for 11 days. He'd been cold for 9 of them. He wasn't thinking about Vane anymore. He was thinking about his feet. His left boot had a seam splitting along the toe, and the cold was getting in through the gap, a thin, mean invasion that had been spreading up his foot for the past hour. He could still feel his toes, but the feeling was the wrong kind. A pins and needles buzz that meant the tissue was angry. He'd seen men lose toes to cold. He'd seen men lose more than that. Keep moving. Don't stop. Movement is heat. The wind shifted, and there it was. A smell so impossibly out of place that for a second he thought he was hallucinating. Wood smoke, rich and real. And beneath it, something that stopped him mid-stride. Meat fat rendering, onion going soft in a hot pan, something spiced and deep and warm drifting across the frozen air like a message from another world. He stood still and breathed it in. Then he turned toward it and walked faster than he'd walked in hours. The camp was in a hollow between 2 ridges, sheltered from the worst of the wind by a wall of old-growth pine. Someone had chosen the location deliberately. It wasn't luck. There was a canvas lean-to strung between 4 trees, properly rigged with the high side into the wind, low side toward the fire. The fire itself was built smart, large enough to cook on, small enough to stay hidden from distance, a ring of stones pulling double duty as windbreak and reflector. Beside the fire, a woman was cooking. She was standing over a cast-iron pot that sat on a flat hearthstone she'd clearly dragged in herself, stirring something with a long wooden spoon and not looking up. She was wearing a heavy wool coat the color of pine bark, a wide-brimmed hat with snow crusting the brim, and work gloves with the fingertips cut off. She was, by any reasonable assessment, a large woman, broad through the shoulders, thick-armed, built like someone who had done hard physical work her entire life and had stopped apologizing for what that looked like somewhere around age 20. She did not startle when he came through the trees. She just said without turning around, "You sound like a wounded elk. Stop walking so loud." Cade stopped. I was still 20 feet away, rifle across his body, not raised. He took stock. 1 horse tied on the far side of the lean-to, packed heavy. 2 canvas bags near the fire. No visible weapon, but the axe buried in a log nearby was within arm's reach if she moved fast. Camp was too well organized for someone who didn't know what they were doing out here. "I can smell that stew from half a mile," he said. "Then you should have found it sooner." She stirred the pot once more, then finally looked over her shoulder at him. Her face was broad and wind-burned, dark eyes, sharp and entirely unimpressed. "Late 20s, maybe 30. You look terrible." "My horse died." "When?" "This afternoon." She looked him over the way a person looks at something broken they're deciding whether to fix. Not with pity. That was the thing. No softness in it, just assessment. Her gaze dropped to his left boot, and something in her expression shifted. "Your foot's gone numb," she said. It wasn't a question. "Getting there. Then sit down before you fall down. You're already listing left." She turned back to the fire and reached for another bowl hanging from the lean-to frame without being asked. "I'm not fishing your body out of the snow in the morning." He came closer slowly. "Old habit. You moved slow near strangers' fires, gave them time to see your hands. You always feed men who wander into your camp? I always feed people who are about to die. It seems like basic courtesy. She ladled something thick and dark into the bowl. Venison, he thought, and root vegetables, and some kind of herb he couldn't identify. She held it out without looking at him. Eat that before you do anything else. Then take the boot off, and let the foot come back slow. Do not put it near the fire. He took the bowl. The heat of it against his frozen hands was almost painful. He sat on a log she'd positioned near the fire. Close enough for warmth, not so close as to put yourself in danger of sparking, and drank the stew more than ate it, tipping the bowl, because his fingers weren't steady enough to manage a spoon. It was extraordinary, not in some delicate, precious way. Extraordinary the way. A thing is extraordinary when it gives you exactly what you need at exactly the right moment. Salt and fat and warmth spreading down his throat, hitting an empty stomach that had forgotten what it felt like to be full. He didn't say anything. She didn't push for conversation. After a few minutes, she sat down across the fire from him with her own bowl, and they ate in the silence of two people who'd been alone long enough that quiet felt more natural than talking. Finally, she said, "What were you tracking?" "Man named Hollis Vane, out of Billings." "Bounty work?" "Tracking work." "There's a difference." She raised an eyebrow. "Is there?" "Bounty hunters bring 'em in dead when dead is easier. I was hired to find him and establish where he crossed the territory line. That's it. Lawyers' work mostly. Locating. And now you've lost him." Snow covered the trail. He looked at the bottom of his bowl. "And my horse died." "You said that already." "It bears repeating." Something crossed her face. Not a smile exactly, but the shape of one threatening to appear. She let it pass. "Rowan Vale," she said. "Cade Mercer." "Where are you headed, Cade Mercer?" "Silver Ridge, eventually." He flexed his left foot carefully. The pins and needles were shifting, becoming something more direct, which was, perversely, a good sign. Pain meant circulation. "You? You?" "Same." She looked at the fire. "I have a meeting there in 10 days. "What kind of meeting?" "The kind that determines whether I spend the next decade working for someone else or building something of my own." She said it flatly, like a weather report. No drama in it. But underneath the flatness was something coiled and taut, the tension of a person who has been waiting a long time for a particular door to open. "I'm a cook." He looked at the pot. "I noticed. Everyone notices when they're hungry." Her voice had an edge to it, small but deliberate. "Most people stop noticing after they've eaten." He considered that. "I wouldn't stop noticing that stew. What was the herb?" She paused, like the question surprised her. "Wild thyme. I dried it in October. And juniper berry a little. Cuts the gaminess." "I've eaten venison stew in 12 different states and territories. None of it tasted like that." She looked at him across the fire, measuring again, deciding something. "You're not just saying that. I've got no reason to flatter you. You've already given me the food." A real pause this time. Then she said quietly, "No." "Most people have already stopped paying attention by then." He took the boot off as she'd instructed. The foot was bad, not frostbitten, but close enough that he sat very still while the blood came back, which was an experience he didn't recommend to anyone. He pressed his sock-footed foot against his opposite calf for warmth and breathed through his nose and did not make the sounds he wanted to make. Rowan watched him from the corner of her eye while she cleaned the pot with snow and a rag, doing it efficiently and without fuss. She wasn't the kind of person who watched you suffer with sympathy. She watched the way a person watches to see if you're going to handle it or not. He handled it. When it was over, he laced the boot back up. She'd stuffed the gap in the seam with a folded piece of leather she'd cut from a strap without asking, and he tested the knot twice. "Thank you," he said. "The leather's just a temporary fix. You need a cobbler." "I need a lot of things." "Don't we all?" She settled back against the log on her side of the fire, pulling her hat down against a fresh gust off the ridge. "You can sleep in the lean-to, your side. I'll take mine." "I wasn't going to presume you were going to sleep in the open because you think asking to share a stranger's shelter is improper, and then you were going to lose the toes on that foot by morning, and I was going to have to feel responsible for it." She pulled a blanket across her lap. "Just sleep in the lean-to, Mercer," he almost argued. The part of him that had spent 15 years navigating the particular unwritten rules of frontier masculinity. What you ask for, what you don't, what accepting help means about you. That part wanted to say something about being fine, about managing. He recognized the reflex for what it was. Stupid. The kind of stupid that killed people out here. All right, he said. Good. She tilted her hat down over her face. And Mercer? If you snore, I'll put you back in the snow. I don't snore. Everyone says that. He slept harder than he'd slept in weeks. The kind of sleep that has no texture, no dreams, no half-waking, just a clean dark that drops you down and holds you there. When he woke, gray light was coming through the trees and the fire was already rebuilt, and a pan was sitting over it with what smelled like salt pork and something starchy. Rowan was breaking camp, not frantically. There was nothing frantic about how she moved, but with a practiced efficiency that spoke of someone who had done this exact thing many times. She'd already rolled her bedding, and she was working on the lean-to rigging, her movements clean and certain. You could have woken me, Cade said. His voice came out rougher than intended. Sleep thick. I didn't need you for anything. I could have helped. You needed the sleep more than I needed the help. She said it without judgment, just fact. The pan's almost ready. Eat fast. I want to make the valley crossing before the next front comes in. He sat up and looked at the sky through the pine canopy. She was right. There was a particular quality to the gray, a heaviness and a stillness that meant weather building somewhere to the northwest. You know this country? He asked. I know weather, and I know maps. She tugged the last rope free from the high pine and began coiling it with the practiced hands of someone who respects rope. I came through from Billings by myself, 3 weeks. She didn't say it like she was proud, just like it was a fact that had happened. Alone? I just said alone. Most people wouldn't. He stopped himself. She looked at him, just looked, waiting. I wasn't going to say you couldn't, he said carefully. I was going to say most people wouldn't attempt it this time of year. Most people have other options. She went back to the rope. I didn't. He ate the salt pork standing up, because she'd already kicked dirt over his sleeping spot and it felt wrong to sit back down on it. The food was simple, nothing like last night, but she'd managed to make even plain salt pork taste like something worth eating, seasoned with whatever she had at hand, cooked to the right side of crisp without going dry. He watched her finish breaking the camp down to nothing. When she was done, there was no real sign anyone had been here. The stones were scattered. The fire pit was cold-packed with snow. The drag marks from the hearthstone had been brushed out with a pine branch. You've done this before, he said. I told you. 3 weeks. Before that, I mean. She was checking the horse's load, tightening straps, not looking at him. A pause. My father was a trapper. Before that, his father. I grew up moving. Another strap, tested and retightened. Learning to cook in a kitchen with 4 walls felt strange for a long time. Where'd you learn? The kitchen work. Hotel in Cheyenne, then another one in Denver. Her voice shifted. Not much, but enough that he noticed. Something went a little flat. I was good at it. Was. He noted the past tense and didn't push. Silver Ridge, he said instead. You mentioned a meeting. The Iron Crest Hotel. They need a kitchen manager for the season. She checked the horse's bridle. I have 1 night to cook for the owner. Show him what I can do. And if it goes well? Then I stop doing this. She gestured at the empty camp, the snow, the trees, herself, and start doing something worth doing. This seemed worth doing to me last night. She turned and looked at him again. That measuring look. It kept you alive, she said. That's different from worth doing. Cade thought about that. He picked up his rifle and his pack. I'll need to cut south to find a trading post, replace some supplies. If you're heading toward the main valley route. The valley route is 3 days in this snow, she said. I know a pass. 2 days, maybe less if the drifts haven't closed it. You sure about the pass? I came through it on the way out. He looked at the sky again, then at her. I don't need company, she said, before he could ask. I've managed fine. I know you have, but... She pulled herself into the saddle with an ease that suggested she'd been doing it her whole life. You're going to Silver Ridge, I'm going to Silver Ridge, and you're down a horse. She adjusted her seat, looked down at him from the saddle. You can keep up, or you can fall behind. Either way, I'm moving at my pace. I can keep up. We'll see. The pass she knew was real, and it was exactly where she said it was, which Cade privately found impressive because the entrance to it was nothing. a gap in the ridgeline that looked like 50 other gaps and only revealed itself as passable once you were already committed to it. She'd marked it on her way east with a particular arrangement of 3 stones on a flat outcrop, and she found the marker without hesitation. 3 weeks out here alone, he said as they entered the pass. That was really the only option? She was riding slightly ahead, letting the horse pick its way through the drifts. Her voice came back over her shoulder, casual and closed at the same time, the voice of someone who has decided how much of a story to tell. The hotel in Denver let me go in October. Why? A beat. Because the owner had a cousin who needed the position. She paused. And because the dining room was booking up, which made me visible. And when I became visible, some of the guests started complaining to management about the person in charge of their food. She chose the word carefully. Nothing in her voice gave it away. The complaints weren't about the food. Cade walked in the snow beside the horse, rifle across his back. He didn't fill the silence with reassurances he didn't have the right to make. I'd been there 4 years, she said. Built the breakfast service from nothing. Took it from 12 covers a morning to 60. She was quiet for a moment. The owner told me I was a valued employee. He said it the same day he handed me the month's wages and told me my last day was Friday. Did you fight it? Of course I fought it. A lot of good it did. Her voice was steady. The steadiness of someone who has been angry about something for long enough that the anger has calcified into something more useful. So I packed what was mine, took the money I'd saved, bought the horse and the supplies, and started west. To Silver Ridge. To Silver Ridge, because the Iron Crest is new. The owner doesn't know what he's looking for yet. And new places... She paused. New places don't have rules about who's allowed to be good at things. Cade thought about that as they moved deeper into the pass, the walls of snow rising on both sides, the wind dropping to almost nothing in the shelter of the gorge. That's a gamble, he said. Everything worth doing is. What if he says no, after the trial night? She turned and looked at him over her shoulder. Her expression wasn't defiant or wounded, just certain. Then I'll find another door, she said, and I'll cook my way through it, because there is nothing in this world, she turned back to the trail, absolutely nothing, that they can take away from me that matters more than what I know how to do. They can take the job. They took the job. They cannot take the skill. Cade said nothing, but something shifted in him, walking through that snow. Something that had been sitting crooked for a long time. He'd been doing this work, the tracking, the chasing, the surviving, for 15 years. He was good at it. He'd always told himself that being good at it was enough, that the work was the thing. But there was a difference, he was starting to realize, between a thing that kept you moving and a thing that actually meant something. He'd been confusing the two for a long time. They made it through the pass by late afternoon and found shelter in the remains of a trapper's cabin. One wall half collapsed, roof intact, the hearth still sound. Rowan assessed it in about 30 seconds and started building a fire before Cade had finished clearing snow from the doorway. You could let me do that, he said. You cleared the door. You did something. She stacked the tinder with the same quiet certainty she brought to everything. Hand me the striker. He handed it over without argument. She had the fire going in under a minute, which was faster than he would have managed, and he knew it. That night she cooked dried beans and bacon into something that tasted like it had been working for hours, and they ate across the fire from each other again. But the silence was different now. Less careful. More like two people thinking in the same room than two strangers negotiating territory. Why tracking? She asked, somewhere in the second bowl. My father was a sheriff, territory of Wyoming. He turned the bowl in his hands. He spent his life trying to build something orderly in a place that resisted it, trying to make people feel safe. He looked at the fire. I never had the patience for that. For the building part. I could follow things, find things. I was good at the hunting. But not the staying. He looked up. She wasn't saying it as a criticism, just observing. No, he said, not the staying. And does that bother you? I was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she'd nearly given up on an answer. More than it used to, he finally said. She nodded, once. Didn't push. Outside, the wind was building again, rattling what remained of the collapsed wall, and sending thin fingers of cold through the gaps around the door. Inside, the fire held. The beans were gone. The night pressed in from all sides. Two people who had both learned to travel light, sitting in an ancient broken shelter, with Silver Ridge still 2 days ahead of them and everything uncertain beyond it. Neither of them moved to sleep. Neither of them tried to fill the quiet with things that didn't need to be said. The fire burned down slowly, and they let it. The second day out of the pass, Cade's boot gave up entirely. Not the seam this time, the sole itself, the left one, peeling away from the upper along the toe in a slow split that got worse with every mile of wet snow. By mid-morning, he was walking with his foot rolling slightly inward to keep the sole pressed flat, which put a bad angle on his knee, which made the whole left side of his body compensate, which made him slower. He didn't say anything about it. Rowan noticed anyway. She noticed the way she noticed most things, without making a production of it, filing it away, letting it sit for a while before acting. Around noon, when they stopped to rest the horse on a flat section of trail where the trees broke and the sun hit the snow at an angle that was almost warm, she dug into one of her canvas bags and produced a length of leather cord and a folding knife without being asked. "Sit," she said. "It's manageable." "I didn't ask if it was manageable. Sit." He sat on a rock and she crouched in the snow in front of him, examining the boot the way she'd examine a problem in her kitchen. Not with frustration, just with the focused attention of someone who wants to understand what they're working with before they start. She wrapped the cord around the toe box in 3 tight passes, cinching the sole back against the upper, then knotted it in a configuration he didn't recognize. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked. "My father's boot did the same thing when I was 9. He was 2 weeks from the nearest town." She made a final tuck in the knot and tested it with 2 fingers. "He used a piece of harness leather. This'll hold better." She stood and put the knife away. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me. It's still going to be miserable." She turned back to the horse. "You just won't lose the whole sole in the first river crossing." It held. Through the river crossing and through the afternoon and through the long descent into the lower valley where the snow thinned and the pines gave way to bare-limbed aspens and the first signs of human presence appeared. A fence line here, a chimney's smoke in the distance, a road that was actually a road instead of a guess. The valley was wider than Cade had expected. Silver Ridge sat at the far end of it, still maybe a day out, but visible from the high ground as a cluster of buildings that was larger than most frontier towns he'd seen. 3 years old, Rowan had told him, established around a silver strike that had played out faster than expected, but left behind infrastructure and commerce that drew people looking for something more stable than the mine. There were banks now, 2 hotels, a telegraph office, 3 churches, a schoolhouse, under construction. The kind of town that was deciding what it wanted to be. "You've done your research," Cade said when she mentioned the telegraph office. "I always do my research." She was riding. He was walking beside her, which had become their natural arrangement over the past 2 days. Her slightly ahead, him on the ground, both of them capable of independence and both of them, somehow, having stopped pretending they preferred it. When I had the job in Denver, I used to read everything I could find about towns that were growing, where the new hotels were going up, who was investing in them, what the dining situation was like. She adjusted her grip on the reins. Information is the only thing that costs you nothing and pays back everything. That's not something most people think about. Most people wait for opportunity to announce itself. She looked at the town on the horizon. "I go looking." The light was changing, the blue-gray of a winter afternoon tipping toward evening, when they reached a crossroads where a weathered signpost pointed south toward Silver Ridge and north toward a place called Dalton's Creek. There was a trading post at the crossroads, a squat log building with a porch and a hitching rail, and a hand-painted sign that read, "Supplies, dry goods." Information, the last word underlined twice as if it were the most valuable commodity on offer. "I need to stop," Cade said. "Restock what I lost with the horse." She pulled up and looked at the trading post, then at the sky. "We've got maybe an hour of usable light. I'll be quick." She dismounted. "Then I'm coming in. I need lamp oil and salt." The inside of the trading post was dim and smelled of leather and tobacco and something chemical he couldn't identify. Probably the tanning supplies stacked in one corner. The man behind the counter was heavy-set and gray-bearded, wearing a canvas apron with a pencil tucked behind one ear. He looked up when they came in. His eyes went to Rowan first, then to Cade, then back to Rowan, and in that second look was something, not hostility exactly, but a particular brand of assessment, the kind that men in positions of small authority sometimes performed on women who came into their spaces without a man in front of them. Cade had seen it before. He watched to see what Rowan would do with it. She walked straight to the back wall where the dry goods were shelved and started reading labels, completely unbothered, or not unbothered. He was starting to understand the difference. She was bothered. She just didn't give it the reaction it was fishing for. Cade went to the counter and listed what he needed: rifle cartridges, dried meat, hardtack, a canteen to replace the cracked one. The man wrote it down slowly, still watching Rowan from the corner of his eye. "She with you?" the man asked, low. "She's traveling to Silver Ridge," Cade said. "Same as me." "Alone?" "She's standing 10 feet away. You could ask her." The man looked at him, recalibrating. He went to pull Cade's supplies. Rowan came to the counter with her lamp oil and salt and set them down. The man added them up without speaking to her directly, which was its own kind of statement. She paid without comment, exact change, placed flat on the counter, and picked up her goods. Outside in the cold, Cade helped her repack the horse's bags. He was trying to figure out what to say, and she could tell, because she said, "Don't." "I wasn't going to." "You were going to say something about him being ignorant or something about how it wasn't right, and I appreciate the impulse, but it doesn't actually help, and it makes me have to manage your feelings about it instead of just moving on." She buckled the strap. "I've been dealing with that since I was 15. I don't need commentary. I need to get to Silver Ridge." He shut his mouth. She was right, and the rightness of it was uncomfortable in the particular way that correct things sometimes are. "Okay," he said. "Okay." She swung up into the saddle. "Let's go." They made camp a mile south of the crossroads, off the road, in a thicket of cottonwoods where a frozen creek made a natural windbreak. Rowan cooked the last of her dried beans with some of the salt pork she'd bought, stretched with a handful of dried corn she'd been keeping in the bottom of one bag. It was sparse, they were both running low, but she did something with it that made it taste like intention instead of scarcity. He didn't know how she did it. He suspected it was something about the order of things, the timing, some understanding of how heat and ingredients talk to each other that went beyond recipe. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You've been asking me things for 2 days. This one's different." He wrapped both hands around his tin cup. "Back in Denver, when the hotel let you go." He paused. "Was the food good? Good? Actually good. Not just, were you actually that good?" She looked at him across the fire. The question seemed to catch her differently than she expected. "Yes," she said simply. "How do you know?" "Because I know what I'm doing, not in an arrogant way. I mean, I understand what I'm doing well enough to know when it's right." She looked into her cup. There were regulars who came in 3 times a week. There was a cattleman from Cheyenne who told the owner personally that the breakfast at that hotel was the reason he conducted his business in Denver instead of going north. She stopped. "The owner told me that story. Used it as evidence of what a good job I was doing. 2 weeks before he fired me." Cade was quiet. "I'm not telling you this for sympathy," she said. "I know you're not. I'm telling you because you asked if I was actually good, and the answer is yes, and I spent 6 months after Denver wondering if I was wrong about that, if I'd overestimated myself, if maybe they were right and the food was only part of the reason people kept coming back." She looked up. "And then I stopped wondering, because I made a meal for myself one night in a boarding house in Laramie. Just for myself, nothing fancy, whatever I could buy at the market. And I sat down and ate it, and I thought, this is good, not because anyone told me, because I could taste that it was true." She sat back. "That was the night I bought the horse." Cade sat with that for a moment. "What did you make?" She blinked. "What?" "The meal. In Laramie." Something shifted in her face. The defensiveness, or whatever it was, the protective layer she kept between her story and the people she told it to, moved slightly. "Potato soup," she said, "with dried herbs and a piece of hard cheese melted in, and bread. I'd been saving a piece of bread." "Potato soup convinced you." "Potato soup reminded me." She looked at the fire. "There's a difference." He thought about the trapper's cabin, the way she'd built the fire before he'd finished clearing the door, the path she'd marked with 3 stones on a flat rock, the beans that tasted like something that had been going for hours. All of it connected. Not a series of skills, but a single deep thing, a way of being in the world that made things work. "You're going to get the job," he said. She shook her head slowly. You don't know that. No. But I've been watching how you do things for 2 days, and I know the difference between someone who is competent and someone who is extraordinary. I've met both. Looked at her steadily. The people at the Iron Crest are going to be lucky. She didn't thank him. Didn't deflect it either. She just let it sit there, this man's plain statement of fact offered across a campfire in the dark. And she looked at it for a moment the way you look at something you want and aren't sure you're allowed to want. You said you've been tracking for 15 years, she said eventually, shifting it. Give or take. What does that get you, financially? He almost laughed at the directness of it. Enough. Some jobs pay well. Some pay in favors, and some pay in nothing. It evens out. But you don't own anything. No. No land. No building. No. He turned his cup in his hands. My father owned a house. Sheriff's salary, modest house, dead by 50 from a job that gave him nothing back except the satisfaction of doing it. He looked at the frozen creek. I told myself the freedom was worth more than the property. Is it? I was quiet for a beat too long. Getting less sure, he said. She nodded, once, the way she did when someone said something true she'd been waiting for them to arrive at. They slept. The night was cold and clear, and somewhere in the cottonwoods an owl made its noise in the dark. And then nothing, and then morning. Silver Ridge came into view for real on the third day out of the pass, around mid-morning, when the road topped a low rise and the valley opened up below them in a wash of winter light. Bigger than it had looked from a distance, and busier. Wagons on the road, smoke from a dozen chimneys, the sound of construction carrying up the hillside. The Iron Crest Hotel sat at the north end of the main street, 3 stories, the newest paint in town, a sign out front that had been freshly lettered. Rowan stopped the horse at the top of the rise and looked at it. Her face was hard to read. Cade stood beside her and looked too. Tomorrow night, she said. The trial dinner? The owner, a man named Aldous Kreft, gave me a week's notice when I wrote him from Billings. Said he'd give me the kitchen on Friday night. Full service. Real guests. She was still looking at the hotel. Either he hires me or he sends me away. He's not going to send you away. You said that last night. I meant it last night, too. She finally looked at him. You're very confident for a man who's only eaten my camp cooking. Camp cooking under those conditions is harder than a proper kitchen. Anyone who can make something taste like that in a trapper's cabin. I know, she said, not arrogant, just steady. Steadying herself, maybe. I know. She straightened in the saddle. I need to find a room and press my clothes and figure out what I'm cooking tomorrow. She took a breath. And you need a cobbler. He looked down at the boot with the leather cord still holding. I need a cobbler, he agreed. They went down into Silver Ridge together, and the town received them the way frontier towns receive strangers, with the minimal acknowledgement of people who have too much of their own business to conduct to pay attention to yours, which was, in its own way, a kind of welcome. At the bottom of the main street they reached a fork. The hotel went right. The row of rooming houses and small businesses went left. Cade had business at the sheriff's office. Hollis Vane's trail was cold, but the information he'd gathered over 11 days was worth something to the territorial office here, and there was the matter of his fee for the days already worked. This is where you go your way, Rowan said. She was looking straight ahead. I'll be a few hours. You don't need to... She stopped. Tried again. I'm fine from here. I know you are. He picked up his pack. Where are you staying? She told him the name of the rooming house she'd written ahead to reserve. On the left fork, as it turned out. The same side of town he was headed. I'll walk you to the door, he said. Mercer. It's on my way. She looked at him sideways. It is not on your way. It's not far off it. A pause. She clicked the horse forward. Fine, walk fast. I have a lot to do. He walked fast. She rode at a pace that kept them even, and when they reached the rooming house, a white 2-story with a painted sign and a porch that needed fixing, she dismounted and tied the horse and carried her own bags inside without looking back. He waited for a moment, in the street. Then she appeared in the doorway. You're going to be late to the sheriff's office, she said. Probably. Go be late then. She started to close the door. Stopped. Mercer. Yeah. She looked at him from the doorway of the rooming house, with Silver Ridge moving around them both. Wagons and voices, and the sound of a hammer somewhere on a new building. and her face was doing the thing where she was deciding how much to say. "Thank you," she said, "for the last 3 days. You kept me alive. You kept up." She said it like that was more than the other thing. "That counts." She closed the door. Cade stood there for a second in the cold street. A wagon went past. Somewhere a dog was barking at something irrelevant. He walked to the sheriff's office and filed his report and collected half his fee. The other half contingent on Vane's actual capture, which was someone else's problem now, and found a cobbler 2 doors down who fixed the boot properly in under an hour for 75 cents. He ate a real meal in a small place on the side street, beef and potatoes, nothing special, cooked by someone who was perfectly competent and nothing more, and he ate it without pleasure. Then he walked back up the main street and stood for a while in front of the Iron Crest Hotel, looking at the dining room windows. Through the glass he could see white tablecloths, already laid for evening service, gas lamps on each table, the kind of room designed to tell people that they were worth impressing. He could see, through a door at the back, the edge of what must be the kitchen, movement back there, someone carrying something, the heat shimmer of cooking. I thought about a woman sitting alone in a boarding house in Laramie, eating potato soup she'd made for herself, deciding that it was good. He thought about 3 days in the snow with someone who had never once needed him in the way he'd been trained to expect, who'd fed him and fixed his boot and found the pass and built every fire, and who had asked nothing in return except that he keep up. He had kept up. I wasn't entirely sure, standing there in the cold outside a hotel dining room in a town he'd arrived in an hour ago, what he was supposed to do with that. He turned and walked back to find a room of his own. Friday was tomorrow. He told himself it was just curiosity that made him want to be in that dining room when Rowan Vale picked up a knife for the first time in 6 months and started fighting her way back to the life she'd been told she didn't deserve. Just curiosity. He almost believed it. That night, in the narrow room above the hardware store that was the cheapest he could find, Cade lay on a bed that was significantly better than the frozen ground, and significantly worse than anything a reasonable person would call comfortable, and stared at the ceiling for a long time. He thought about Hollis Vane, somewhere in the territory, still free. He thought about the circuit judge in Billings, who'd want a full report and might or might not pay the second half of the fee. He thought about the next job. There was always a next job, always another name on a warrant, another trail going cold. He thought about what Rowan had said at the Crossroads trading post. It doesn't actually help, and it makes me have to manage your feelings about it. The flat truth of it. The way she'd said it not angrily, but with a weariness that was worse than anger. The weariness of someone who has explained this before, and will have to explain it again, and has simply gotten efficient at it. He thought about the hotel owner in Denver, telling her the cattleman story. "You're doing a wonderful job," 2 weeks before the end. He thought about what it must take to pack your life into canvas bags, buy a horse, and head west into January alone, on the strength of a letter from a hotel you'd never seen, because the alternative was to shrink into something that fit the space other people had decided to give you. He'd been doing this work for 15 years because he was good at it, and because it kept moving. He told himself the motion was freedom. But freedom to do what exactly? Follow trails that ended in someone else's courthouse. Sleep in a different room every month. Own nothing except his skill and his reputation, both of which were good, and both of which added up to a kind of profound emptiness he'd been moving fast enough not to examine directly. He fell asleep eventually and dreamed of nothing he could remember. In the morning, Silver Ridge was already loud. A town building itself, full of the noise of that. Construction and commerce, and the particular energy of a place that hasn't decided yet what it's going to be. Cade stood at his window with a cup of coffee from the hardware store owner's wife, who'd charged him a nickel for it and handed it over without conversation, which he appreciated. He could see, from the angle of the window, the upper floor of the rooming house 2 streets over where Rowan was staying. He wondered if she was already awake. He already knew the answer. She'd been awake for hours, probably, working through the menu in her head, running the numbers on the kitchen, what equipment was there, what she'd need to commandeer, how to make one service tell a man everything he needed to know about what she was capable of. He drank his coffee. Outside, someone was hammering a new sign onto a building across the street. The sign, he could just make out, read, First Silver Ridge Land and Title Company, established 1882. People were establishing things everywhere, building things that had their names on them, putting down stakes. He finished the coffee, set the cup on the windowsill, and went downstairs to find breakfast. Tonight was Friday. He was going to that dining room. He almost didn't go in. Cade stood on the boardwalk outside the Iron Crest for a full 2 minutes, looking at the dining room through the window, his hand not quite reaching for the door. The place was already filling up. He could see that much. White tablecloths, gas lamps turned up for the evening, the particular kind of crowd that shows up to a nice hotel dining room on a Friday. Cattle buyers, a judge by the look of his coat, two women in town clothes who'd made an effort, a table of men who had the look of investors or lawyers or both. People who were accustomed to being served and had opinions about it. I thought about Rowan somewhere behind those kitchen doors right now, and pushed through the entrance. The hostess who met him was a young woman with a practiced smile and the subtle but unmistakable air of someone assessing whether he belonged here. He'd had a shave and put on the cleanest shirt he owned, but the shirt wasn't much, and the coat was the coat he'd been wearing through the mountains. "Dinner for one, sir?" she said. "Please." She seated him at a table near the window, which meant he could see both the dining room and the street outside, which was habit. He always sat with lines of sight. The table was square in the middle of the room, surrounded by other occupied tables, close enough to the kitchen door that he'd hear it every time it swung open. A young man came to take his drink order. "Water," Cade said. The young man wrote it down without expression. The dining room continued to fill. By 7 o'clock it was nearly at capacity, which he suspected was unusual for a Friday this early in a town Silver Ridge's age. Word had spread about something. He'd heard it at the hardware store that afternoon. A customer mentioning the hotel had a new cook trying out tonight, someone from back east with a reputation. That wasn't quite right, but rumors never were. At 7:10, the kitchen door swung open and a plate came out. He watched the waiter carry it across the room to the table of investors. He couldn't see what was on it from this distance, but he saw the moment the man at the head of the table looked down at his food and stopped talking mid-sentence. His companions looked at him. He picked up his fork. The table went quiet. Cade turned his menu over in his hands and waited. His own plate arrived 20 minutes later. He'd ordered whatever the waiter recommended, partly because he didn't trust his own judgment in a place like this, and partly because he wanted to see what she was actually sending out into the room. The waiter set it in front of him with the faintly ceremonial air of someone presenting something they were proud of, which was not how waiters usually operated. Cade looked at the plate. Roasted venison, sliced thin and fanned out, with a dark reduction pooled beside it. Something deeply savory, a little sweet, something wood smoke in it. Potatoes turned and roasted golden. A sprig of something green he didn't recognize, placed like it meant something rather than like someone had dropped it there. He cut into the meat. The knife went through it like it had been waiting for him. He ate slowly, which was not his nature. He ate slowly because there was something happening in the flavor of this food that he wanted to pay attention to. Layers of it, things revealing themselves in sequence. Not complicated for complication's sake. It tasted like the land it came from. It tasted like someone who understood that venison in January, in Montana, in a hotel dining room full of people who might be prejudiced against the hand that made it, needed to be so completely, undeniably right that no other conversation was possible. He put his fork down halfway through and just sat for a second. The dining room around him had gotten quieter than dining rooms usually got. People were eating and not talking, which was the thing you couldn't manufacture. People talk through food they find merely good. They go quiet when something stops them. The table of investors had ordered seconds. He could see the waiter taking the note back to the kitchen. Across the room, near the far wall, a heavy-set man in an expensive suit was watching the room with the careful attention of someone calculating. Aldous Kreft, Cade guessed, the hotel owner. He hadn't touched his own meal yet. He was watching his guests eat. Cade watched Kreft watch the room. A woman at the table nearest the kitchen door said something to her husband, leaning toward him, and even across the noise of the room, Cade caught the word extraordinary. The husband nodded, chewing. He hadn't said anything clever back. There wasn't anything clever to say. Cade picked up his fork and finished the meal. When the waiter came to take his plate, Cade asked, "Is the cook available?" The waiter blinked. There are still 12 covers outstanding, sir. After service, then. Could you tell her Cade Mercer is here?" The waiter wrote the name on his pad, more to have something to do with his hands than because he needed to, and went back through the kitchen door. The door swung twice and then settled, and the noise of the kitchen came through for a moment. Not chaos, but intensity. The compressed energy of people moving fast in a small space with a clear hierarchy and a clear purpose. He ordered coffee and waited. Kreft had started eating. Cade watched the man's face carefully. He was good at reading faces. It was the job, stripped to its essential skill. Kreft ate 2 bites and set his fork down. He picked it back up. He finished half the plate and then set it aside entirely and called the waiter over and said something that made the waiter nod and disappear toward the kitchen. The room was still eating. A new table had come in. Latecomers, a rancher type with his wife and what appeared to be a business associate. And they were seated and handed menus, and the rancher's wife read hers and said something to her husband that made him look up and signal the waiter with a kind of urgency that didn't match the formality of the room. At 9:30, the kitchen door opened and stayed open for a second longer than usual, and Cade looked up. Rowan stood in the doorway. She was wearing a white kitchen apron over her work clothes, both of them showing the evidence of a real service, smears and heat flush, and the particular posture of someone who has been moving fast for 3 hours and whose feet know it. Her hair had come partially loose from where she'd pinned it. She looked across the dining room once, taking inventory the way she took inventory of everything. Fast, total, efficient, and then she saw him. Something in her face shifted. Not surprise exactly, but something close to it and softer. She came across the room and pulled out the chair across from him and sat down without being invited, which was exactly what he'd have expected. "You came," she said. "I came. You could have told me. You had work to do." She looked at his empty plate. "And?" He looked at her steadily. "Rowan, just say it." "I already told you," he said. "2 nights ago. I meant it." She looked away, out the window at the dark street. Her hands were on the table, cook's hands, he'd noticed before, strong-fingered and scarred in small ways. She had a burn mark on her right forearm, pale and old, the kind you got from a hot rack in a busy kitchen when you were young and still learning to move around ovens. "Kreft came back twice," she said. "I know. I watched him. His manager said, before service, when I was setting up—" She stopped, exhaled. "The manager told me the regular Friday service is about 40 covers. He said it like it was a warning, like I should be grateful for 40 covers and not expect much." She picked at a small burn on the table's edge, a nervous habit she probably didn't know she had. "We did 63 tonight. There were people waiting by 8 o'clock. Where did the extras come from? Word of mouth. The hostess said 3 separate tables told her they'd heard something about a new cook." She shook her head slightly. 3 hours. That's how fast it traveled. Good food travels fast in a town with limited options. It's not just limited options. She looked back at him. "I don't want it to be just limited options." "It wasn't," he said. "I've eaten well enough in enough places to tell you with certainty it wasn't." Kreft appeared from across the room, moving toward them with the deliberate pace of a man who has made a decision and is coming to deliver it. It was shorter than he'd appeared from a distance, maybe 50, with a neatly trimmed beard and the particular kind of expensive clothes that frontier money bought. Good quality, slightly wrong, like he'd ordered from a catalog in Chicago and hadn't quite got the fit right. He stopped at the table and looked at Cade first, then at Rowan. "Miss Vale," he said, "might I have a word?" "You can say it in front of him," Rowan said. Her voice was level. She didn't stand up. Kreft glanced at Cade again, recalibrating. He pulled a chair from the empty table beside them and sat, which was not what he'd planned to do. His plan had probably involved a more formal setting. Rowan had taken that away from him by not standing, and he was adapting. "The service tonight," he said, "was unlike anything we've had in this room." "All right," Rowan said. "I've had 3 guests speak to me directly. One of them was Judge Carver, who I'll tell you eats dinner at the Meridian in Billings, whenever he's there." He paused. "He said it was better." Rowan said nothing. She was watching Kreft the way she watched everything, waiting to see what it actually was beneath what it appeared to be. "I'd like to offer you the position of head chef," Kreft said. "Kitchen manager, effectively. Full authority over menu and staff, salary to be determined, but I'm prepared to be competitive." He folded his hands on the table. "I'll want you to start on Monday." Silence. Cade kept his face neutral and watched Rowan. "I have some conditions," she said. Kreft blinked. He'd expected something different from her. Gratitude, probably. Relief, certainly. Not conditions delivered in the same tone you'd use to discuss the weather. "Of course," he said, recovering. "Within reason." "The kitchen staff currently 4 people?" She'd clearly assessed this already. The young man on the bread station, the two women on prep. I keep them. I don't inherit someone else's staff only to have them replaced with your cousin's recommendations. Kref's mouth moved slightly. I don't have a... It's a figure of speech, she said. I keep the staff I work with, and when I need to add someone, I do the hiring. That's... Yes, that's standard. I want it in writing. A pause. All right, and the menu changes with the season. I'm not cooking the same 6 dishes every Friday because it's what the previous cook served. What I make depends on what's available, what's good, and what I decide. She held his gaze. I'm not going to cook inferior food because it's familiar. Kreft looked at his hands for a moment. He was deciding whether this was the right kind of difficult or the wrong kind. Cade could see him calculating. The 63 covers, the judge's comment, the 3 tables that had said something directly. Agreed, Kreft said. Then Monday is fine. She stood, which meant the conversation was over, and extended her hand. He shook it, slightly off balance, and she nodded once and walked back to the kitchen without looking back. Kreft sat for a moment at the table, looking at the kitchen door, with the expression of a man who had come to deliver good news and had somehow ended up being interviewed. Then he stood, straightened his coat, and went back across the room to his corner. Cade sat alone with his coffee. He was smiling, which wasn't something he did often enough to do gracefully. I was still smiling when the kitchen door swung open 20 minutes later and the kitchen noise died down behind it, and Rowan came out in her coat, the apron gone, her hair repinned imperfectly, in the way of someone who'd done it without a mirror. She stopped at his table. Don't say I told you so, she said. I wasn't going to. You were thinking it. I was thinking it, he agreed. He stood and pulled on his coat. Let me walk you back. Mercer, it's late and I'm going that direction anyway. You live in the opposite direction. I know where I live. She looked at him for a second with that measuring look, and then something in her face changed. Not softened exactly, but settled, like a decision being made and then made. Fine, she said. Walk fast. Outside the air was clean and brutal, the kind of January night that reminded you what cold actually was after you'd been indoors for a few hours. The street was mostly quiet now, a few lights and windows, a couple of men coming out of the saloon down the block. Their breath fogged together in the lamplight as they walked, not touching, not quite side by side, in the way of two people who haven't figured out their geometry yet. 3 conditions, Cade said. 2.5. The staff thing isn't really a condition, it's just reasonable practice. He looked surprised. He expected me to say yes and thank him. She walked with her hands in her coat pockets, her pace quick against the cold. People always expect that, especially... She didn't finish. Especially people who look like you. Especially people who look like me, who've been waiting for a yes, who've been told no enough times that a yes feels like something you shouldn't push on. Her voice was even, not bitter, just factual. But a yes with no conditions isn't an agreement, it's a surrender. They walked a block in silence. You know what bothered me most about Denver? She said. Not the firing, not even... I could understand the logic of it, even if the logic was wrong. What bothered me was that I'd been so grateful for the opportunity that I'd never asked for what I actually needed. I just kept hoping that being good would be enough, that they'd see it and it would matter. She looked at the dark sky between the buildings. It wasn't enough. Not because the work wasn't good, because I never made them accountable to the work. You did tonight. I tried. She paused. We'll see if it holds on Monday when he's had the weekend to reconsider and talk to his manager. If he reconsiders, you walk. Of course I walk, but I'd rather not have to. She stopped at the corner across from the rooming house. This is me. They stood on the corner, the lamplight casting long shadows, the cold doing what cold does, making everything feel more immediate than it maybe was, or maybe exactly as immediate as it was. Thank you, she said, for being there tonight. I didn't do anything. You were there. She said it simply, like that was enough. Like it actually was. I spent the last hour of service knowing there was someone in that dining room who was rooting for it, not just for the food to be good, for me to get what I went out there to get. She looked at him directly, which she always did when she was saying something she meant. That's not nothing. I didn't know what to say to that. He was not a man who was accustomed to being told that his presence mattered. He'd spent 15 years cultivating a kind of invisibility. Show up, find the thing, disappear. Don't be the story. Don't be the thing that matters. I'll be there Monday, he said, if that's all right. She studied him. Are you staying in Silver Ridge? He hadn't decided that. He hadn't made any decisions, was the thing. The Vane job was essentially over. He'd filed his report, collected what was owed. There was no next thing lined up. There was just this town, this winter, and a woman standing on a corner who had just walked into a hotel dining room and rearranged everyone's expectations of what was possible. For a while, he said. She nodded slowly, not pushing it, not pulling it apart. Monday, then. She crossed the street to the rooming house and went up the porch steps and through the door, and the light in a second-floor window went on a few minutes later. Cade walked back toward his room the long way, through the quiet streets of a town still finding itself, past the half-built schoolhouse and the new land office, and the telegraph lines that connected all of this to places that didn't know it existed yet. The cold was still absolute, but he didn't feel it the way he had 3 days ago in the mountains. Something had shifted in his body's relationship with this particular place. Not comfort, exactly. Something more like attention. The feeling of being somewhere that was worth watching. He should have been thinking about the next job. Should have been calculating whether to wire Billings tomorrow or wait until Monday, whether there was work in Silver Ridge itself, or whether he'd need to ride out again in a week. This was how the job worked. You finished one and you started looking for the next. Because the motion was the income and the income was the life. Instead, he was thinking about a hotel dining room going quiet. He was thinking about 63 covers. I was thinking about a woman who built fires before the door was clear, who found passes by 3 stones on a flat rock, who sat across from a hotel owner and listed her conditions without checking her voice for the right amount of gratitude. He let himself into the room above the hardware store and lay down on the bad bed in his clothes because it was too cold to undress, and looked at the ceiling in the dark for a long time. Monday, he'd said. I was still employed, technically, or could be if he wired Billings. Technically, he owed that to himself, owed it to the work, owed it to 15 years of motion that had its own logic and its own gravity. You kept going. That was the job. That was the life. But the ceiling of a cheap room in a frontier town said nothing back to him, and the cold outside pressed against the window glass. And somewhere in this town a woman was lying awake making plans for a kitchen that was finally going to be hers. And the more Cade stared at the dark, the less certain he became that motion was the same thing as a life. He fell asleep with that thought unfinished, which was probably the best thing for it. Some things needed to sit in the dark for a while before they were ready to be understood. Outside, Silver Ridge kept building itself, nail by nail, dream by dream, into whatever it was going to become. Monday arrived with the sky that had finally cleared after days of flat gray winter blue so sharp it almost hurt to look at. Cade was outside the Iron Crest at 10 in the morning, because he'd said he would be, and he was not a man who said things he didn't mean. He hadn't wired Billings. He had not thought too carefully about what that meant. Rowan was already inside. He could see through the kitchen window from the alley. She'd gone in at 7, he'd been told by the hostess, who said it with the slightly dazed air of someone who had expected this job to be easier and was revising that expectation upward. Rowan had apparently spent the first 2 hours doing an inventory of everything in the kitchen, every pan, every dry good, every spice jar, and had then presented the kitchen manager with a handwritten list of what needed to be replaced, what needed to be ordered, and what she intended to do with what remained. The kitchen manager, a man named Orrin who'd been with Kreft since the beginning, had brought the list to Kreft. Kreft had approved it. Cade learned all of this from the hostess in the span of 3 minutes, which told him that word was moving inside the hotel in the efficient way that word moved through small, enclosed working environments. Everyone had an opinion about the new person. Most of the opinions seemed to be cautious but curious, which was probably the best you could hope for on day 1. He went in through the front and found a seat at the bar. The hotel had a small bar adjacent to the dining room, and ordered coffee and opened a 2-day-old newspaper he'd bought for a penny and hadn't read yet, and waited. He didn't know exactly what he was waiting for. At noon, the kitchen door opened and Rowan came out, still in her whites, wiping her hands on a cloth. She saw him at the bar and came over without expression and sat beside him and said to the bartender, "Whatever's hot." The bartender, who had also apparently been given the memo about the new cook, poured her coffee without comment. "How is it?" Cade asked. "The kitchen is workable. The knives are terrible. I've sharpened 3 of them already and the others I've thrown in a box." She drank the coffee like she'd needed it for hours. "Orrin is fine. He's been cooking the same 12 dishes for 8 months, and he's good at them, and he does not yet understand that the menu is changing, but he will. Any resistance? Not yet. Ask me in a week. She set the cup down. There's a girl on the prep station, Lily. She's 17, been here since the hotel opened. She's been doing vegetable prep for 8 months, and nobody's bothered to teach her anything past that. She turned the cup in her hands. I showed her how to break down a stock this morning. She picked it up in 20 minutes. Something in her voice when she said it. Something that hadn't been in her voice when she talked about Kreft or the knives or the inventory. Not softness, exactly. More like recognition. The specific pleasure of a person who has been underestimated seeing it happen to someone else and being able to do something about it. You're going to build something here, Cade said. She looked at him sideways. I'm trying to get through the first week. You're going to build something here, he said again, not moving from it. She was quiet for a moment. Maybe, she said, which was, from Rowan Vale, about as close to yes as you got on a Monday. Outside the hotel window, Silver Ridge was going about its business in the hard winter light. The schoolhouse construction was audible 3 blocks away. A wagon had stopped in front of the mercantile, and 2 men were unloading crates. Somewhere on the far end of the street, new timber was going up on a building that hadn't been there last week, a town becoming itself. And in the kitchen behind the door that kept swinging open, a woman doing the same thing. Cade ordered another coffee and didn't reach for the newspaper. He was beginning to understand, already made a decision. He just hadn't said it out loud yet. The job in Billings could wait. The next warrant could wait. 15 years of motion could wait 1 more week, 1 more month, however long it took for him to understand what he was actually doing in this town, that wasn't just watching Rowan Vale get what she'd earned. I was, for the first time in a long time, somewhere he didn't want to leave. That was new. It was also, he thought, probably worth paying attention to. 3 weeks into the job, Rowan stopped sleeping through the night. It wasn't the work itself that kept her awake. The work was the thing that made sense, the still point around which everything else turned. It was everything surrounding the work. The politics of a hotel kitchen, the way that power inside a small institution moved like water finding cracks in stone, quiet and persistent and capable of considerable damage. Kreft's manager, a thin man named Harlan Voss, who had been running the Iron Crest staff since the beginning, had decided within the first week that Rowan was a problem he needed to manage. He didn't say this. He didn't do anything overt enough to be confronted. He simply began a campaign of small obstructions. The orders she'd put in for new knives were delayed because the paperwork had been misfiled. The delivery schedule she'd set up with the meat supplier was quietly changed back to the old one. When she asked Lily to take on a more complex prep task, Voss appeared later that day to tell Lily that her primary responsibility was still root vegetables, and that she shouldn't get above herself. He said this to a 17-year-old girl in the back corridor where he thought no one could hear it. Rowan heard it. She waited until Lily had moved on, and then she found Voss in the supply room and closed the door behind her. What you said to Lily, she started. I was clarifying her duties. You were telling a 17-year-old girl not to learn things. Her voice was quiet, which was more dangerous than loud, and he seemed to sense that. Don't do it again. Miss Vale, I've been managing this staff for... Lily works in my kitchen. What happens in my kitchen is my concern. You agreed to that. Kreft agreed to that, in writing. She held his gaze. The next time you go into my kitchen to interfere with my staff, I'm going to have that conversation with Kreft directly. And I'm going to bring the written agreement with me. Voss looked at her for a long moment. He was the kind of man who had learned to use silence as pressure, the kind who waited people out and let the discomfort do the work. He'd probably used it successfully 100 times. He seemed genuinely uncertain when it didn't work on her, when she just stood there in the same silence, waiting just as long as he needed to wait, because she'd been having variations of this conversation since she was 22 years old, and she had run out of discomfort a long time ago. Understood, he said finally, flat, giving nothing. Good. She opened the supply room door and went back to her kitchen, but the encounter cost her something, not her position. She knew she'd won the immediate ground. It cost her something internal, the energy that conflict takes even when you're right, the particular exhaustion of having to fight for the right to do your job on top of actually doing your job. She came home that night with her feet hurting and her head hurting worse, and sat on the edge of her bed in the rooming house and stared at the wall and thought about Denver. About how it had started in Denver. Small obstructions, small condescensions, the accumulated weight of 100 tiny resistances that she'd told herself she could outlast. She hadn't outlasted it. They'd fired her before she got the chance. She was still sitting there an hour later when someone knocked on the door of the rooming house. The landlady called up that a Mr. Mercer was asking for her. She went downstairs. Cade was standing in the small parlor with his hat in his hands, which she'd noticed he did when he was uncertain about something. Held it rather than hung it, kept it as something to do with his hands. He looked at her face when she came down the stairs, and whatever he saw there made him set the hat on the side table and not pick it up again. "What happened?" he said. She told him. Not everything. She edited, compressed, took out the parts that felt too raw. She told him about Voss and Lily and the supply room, and she told him she'd handled it, and she told him it was fine. He listened. He didn't interrupt, which was something she'd learned about him. He was better at listening than most people, which she suspected had to do with the tracking work and what it required. You didn't find things by talking. When she finished, he said, "Is it actually fine?" She looked at him. "It's managed." "That's not the same thing." "No," she said after a moment, "it's not." He sat down in one of the parlor chairs, uninvited, which was also something she'd learned about him. He sat down in rooms when the conversation required it, because standing felt like you were on your way out. She sat across from him. "He's not going to stop," Cade said. "Probably not." "What does Kreft do if you escalate?" "I don't know yet. Kreft isn't a bad man. He's a practical man." She folded her hands in her lap. "The question is whether my value to him is greater than the disruption of Voss being unhappy." "After that Friday service? After the judge?" "Friday was 3 weeks ago." She looked at the window, the dark glass reflecting the lamp. "Memories are short, and new cooks are exciting until they aren't. So build something they can't forget." "That's what I'm doing." She said it sharply, not at him. The sharpness was at the situation, but it landed in the space between them, and she let it sit there rather than taking it back. She was tired. She was tired, and she hadn't expected to be this tired this quickly, and the not expecting it made it worse. "I know what I'm doing, Cade." "I know you do." "Then don't give me advice about it." "All right." Silence. Not a bad one. The parlor was warm, and the landlady had gone upstairs, and they were alone in the small room with the lamp burning low. "I just needed to say it out loud to someone," she finally said. "That's all." "Okay, eh? Not advice. Not a plan. Just—" She made a gesture she couldn't quite finish. "I know," he said. She believed him. She went back upstairs eventually and slept better than she had in a week, which she chose not to examine too closely. Cade had taken on work in Silver Ridge, not tracking, not bounty work, but the kind of practical labor that a frontier town always had available for a capable man who knew how to move through difficult terrain and make good decisions under pressure. He'd been hired by the land office to survey a disputed boundary line, which had taken 10 days and involved 2 difficult conversations with neighboring ranchers who each believed the other was lying. He'd handled both conversations the same way he handled most things, directly, without raising his voice, and with the kind of patient certainty that made people understand you weren't going anywhere until the matter was resolved. I was good at it. He was, it turned out, good at several things that weren't tracking outlaws. He still hadn't wired Billings. The weeks accumulated. February arrived with a cold that was somehow worse than January's, because by February, people had stopped being philosophical about winter and just wanted it to end. The Iron Crest dining room continued to fill on Fridays and began filling on Wednesdays, and by the end of February, Kreft had approved Rowan's request to open for a full 6 nights. She'd built a lunch service on top of the dinner, which required reorganizing the kitchen schedule entirely and adding 2 new staff members, both of whom she hired herself. Lily had become something different in the kitchen. Rowan had been teaching her every spare moment, sauces, stocks, the logic of seasoning, how to taste something and understand what it needed, rather than just adding more of what you'd already put in. The girl learned fast and with a hunger that reminded Rowan of herself at that age. Standing in a trapper's camp kitchen, watching her father reduce a pot of game bones down to something that tasted like the forest had given everything it had. "You could be a real cook," Rowan told her one afternoon, while they were breaking down stock together. Lily didn't look up from what she was doing. "Mr. Voss says—" "I don't care what Mr. Voss says," Rowan said flatly. "I'm telling you what I see." Lily looked up then. She was a small girl, brown-haired, with the kind of quiet that came from being told to be quiet too many times. You really think so? I teach people what they can handle and I don't bother with the rest. You've handled everything I've given you. Rowan went back to her own pot. So yes, I really think so. It was one of the better moments of those months. There were also worse moments. In early March, the trouble that had been building underneath the surface finally broke through. Voss had been cultivating something. Rowan understood this in retrospect, the way you understand things after they've happened. He'd been building a coalition of quiet grievances among the hotel's established staff, the people who'd been there before her, threading a narrative through the back corridors and the break room, that the new cook was difficult, that she was creating a fractious environment, that the changes she'd made were alienating the kitchen staff rather than improving things. He'd done it slowly enough that by the time Rowan became aware of the shape of it, it had been going on for weeks. What broke it into the open was a Tuesday morning in the third week of March, when she arrived to find that the produce delivery she'd ordered, specific items, a particular arrangement she'd worked out with a farm 30 miles south, had been canceled. Voss had signed the cancellation. He'd substituted a standard order from the hotel's old supplier, the same inferior produce the kitchen had been working with before she arrived. She stood in the delivery bay holding the new invoice and understood that this wasn't about produce. She found Kreft before lunch. He was in his office, and he had the wary look of a man who knows a conversation is coming and has been calculating how to navigate it, which meant he already knew. The delivery, Rowan said. She put the invoice on his desk. Kreft looked at it. Harlan mentioned there was a discrepancy. Harlan canceled my order and replaced it with inferior goods without telling me. That's not a discrepancy. She sat down across from him without being invited because this was that kind of conversation. And I think you know that. Kreft was quiet for a moment. Harlan has been with this hotel since before we opened. He has a particular way of doing things. I know he does, and I've been working around it for 2 months because I thought it was manageable. She looked at Kreft directly. It's not manageable anymore. He canceled my order. That affects what I put on the plate on Friday night. That affects what people come back for. And people are coming back, Mr. Kreft. Your dining room went from 40 covers to 120 in 8 weeks. She paused. That didn't happen because of Harlan's way of doing things. Kreft looked at the invoice. He looked at his desk. He looked like a man standing between two things that both had weight and trying to figure out which one would tip him over. I'll speak to him, he said finally. I need more than that. He looked up. I need to know that what I agreed to in writing is actually what I have, she said. Kitchen authority means kitchen authority. It doesn't mean authority unless Harlan disagrees. She kept her voice level. She'd rehearsed none of this. It was coming out of the same place the conditions had come from on the night of the trial service, the same place that had driven her out of Denver and into 3 weeks of winter mountains and into this room. If you can't give me that, tell me now. I'll find somewhere I can have it. The threat was real and they both knew it. She had no other place lined up. She hadn't looked, hadn't wanted to, had genuinely wanted this to be the thing she'd been fighting toward. But she would leave. She'd done it before. Kreft was quiet for a long moment. I'll speak to Harlan today, he said, and I'll put it in writing. Kitchen authority, no exceptions. He picked up the invoice. And I'll get your produce order reinstated. Thank you, she said, and meant it because she didn't waste the words. She walked out of his office and through the lobby and out the front door and stood in the March cold for several minutes with her eyes closed, breathing. She'd won. Again. But winning this way constantly was its own kind of losing. Each victory cost something she couldn't quite name and couldn't get back. She was building a kitchen worth having inside an institution that didn't fully want to let her have it, and the gap between those two things was something she'd been filling with her own energy for months. And she was beginning to understand that energy wasn't an infinite resource. She didn't know how long she stood there. She knew that when she opened her eyes, Cade was crossing the street toward her. He'd been at the land office 2 buildings down. She could see his coat, the survey papers rolled under his arm. He'd clearly seen her come out and stand there and decided something. He stopped in front of her, looked at her face. Come eat something, he said. I have a lunch service. In an hour. Come eat something first. They went to the small restaurant on the side street, the one that wasn't hers, the one with the competent and uninspired cooking, and they sat at a table in the corner and he ordered for both of them without asking, which she would have objected to except she didn't have the energy, and he ordered well. He'd been coming here long enough that he knew what they did acceptably. She told him about Voss and the produce and Kreft. He listened. He didn't say I told you so, which he had told her 3 weeks ago. He'd said Voss wasn't going to stop, and he'd been right, and he didn't use it. You won, he said when she finished. I know. But she cut a piece of bread into smaller pieces she wasn't going to eat. But I'm tired of winning like this. I'm tired of the kitchen being a thing I have to fight for every week instead of a thing I just get to work in. She looked at the bread pieces. I've been thinking. She stopped. About what? She looked up at him. This was the thing she'd been circling for weeks, the thing that lived at the edge of her thinking, and which she hadn't said out loud to anyone because saying it out loud made it real, and real things could fail. About my own place, she said. Not Kreft's kitchen, mine. Cade put down his fork. A restaurant, she said. Small. Not a hotel. I don't want a hotel. A restaurant where the food is the thing, not the tablecloths. Where ranch hands can sit next to bankers and both of them get the same food, because what I cook is good enough to cross that line. She was looking at him steadily, watching his face for the reaction. Where I do the hiring and I set the menu and no one can cancel my produce order because there's no Harlan Voss. There's just me. And where's the money coming from? He said. I have savings. Not enough. She paused. I'd need a partner. The words sat on the table between them. Neither of them moved. Cade picked up his fork, set it down again. He looked out the window at the street where Silver Ridge was doing what it did. Building, moving, deciding what it was going to be. He looked like he was doing the same thing internally. Deciding. I have money, he said. Cade, not a lot. But I've been working for 15 years and spending almost none of it, because there was nothing to spend it on. He looked at her. A surveying fee here, a tracking fee there. It adds up when you have no fixed costs. I'm not asking you to... I know you're not asking. He said it plainly, no drama in it. I'm offering. She looked at him across the table with the same measuring look she'd given him that first night across a campfire, but it was different now. Deeper, because she knew more of what she was measuring. She knew he kept his word. She knew he showed up. She knew he'd walked her home through a dozen cold nights, and never once made it into something she had to manage. Never required gratitude in any form that cost her. This isn't a small decision, she said. No, you'd be walking away from the work you know. I've been walking away from it for 2 months. I just haven't said so out loud yet. He met her gaze. I haven't wired billing since January. There's no next job lined up. I've been doing land surveys because I needed something to do with my hands while I figured out what I was doing with my life. He picked up the fork again. This would be what I'm doing with my life. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the restaurant filled and emptied around them and their plates went cold. He didn't push. He just waited, in the particular way she'd learned he waited, without fidgeting, without filling the space, just present. There's a building, she finally said. Where? North end of Main Street, past the feed store. It's been empty since November. The previous tenant was a dry goods operation that went under. She'd been walking past it for 2 months. She knew this because she'd been walking past it deliberately, the way you walk past something you want and are afraid to want too directly. It's got a back room big enough for a kitchen if we take out 2 interior walls. The street face is good. People walk that block. Have you talked to the owner? No. Why not? She looked at him. Because talking to the owner makes it real. He nodded. Understood. Let it sit. Let's go look at it, he said. Now? Unless you have somewhere else to be. She looked at her cold plate, then at him. I have a lunch service in 20 minutes. After lunch service. She worked the service, a full room, which was satisfying in the uncomplicated way that doing your job well in front of people who appreciate it is satisfying. Lily ran the bread station without supervision now, which was its own particular satisfaction. Rowan moved through the kitchen in the focused, efficient way that was her natural mode when nothing was going wrong and nothing went wrong. At 2 o'clock, she took off her apron and walked out the back and found Cade waiting on the side street, which she had told him she would in a note she'd passed through the hostess. They walked to the building together. It was a 2-story structure, board and batten siding in need of paint, a wide front window that was dusty but intact, a door with a rusted latch that gave way after some persuasion. Inside it smelled of the dry goods operation, flour dust and something chemical, and the particular emptiness of a space that had been alive and isn't anymore. Rowan walked the front room first. It was large, larger than it looked from outside. The front windows let in good light. The floor was solid pine, worn but sound. She paced the dimensions by stepping, counting. She went to the back. 2 interior walls, yes, they'd need to come out. But the back door opened to an alley with good access for deliveries, which mattered. The flue connection was already there, which meant a range could go in without a full rebuild. She looked at the ceiling height, the window on the east wall that would give the kitchen morning light. Cade watched her move through the space. He didn't say anything. He could see what she was doing. She was cooking in it already, in her head. She was moving through service in a room that was currently full of flour dust and old regrets, and she was making it into something. She came back to the front room and stood in the middle of it. The walls and back aren't load-bearing, she said. We'd need a carpenter who knows what he's doing, but it's not a complicated job. I know a man, Cade said. He did the survey with me last month. He's building in between his contract work. She looked at the front window. Tables there and there. The bar. Not for drinking, for eating at, along that wall. The kitchen entirely open on one side so people can see it. She paused. I want people to be able to see the kitchen. Why? Because it's not magic, it's work. I want them to see the work. She turned to face him. I want people to walk in and see a woman and her staff doing the work, and I want them to eat the food, and I want them to understand that those two things are the same thing. That there's nothing mysterious about it, just someone who knows what they're doing and is allowed to do it. Cade looked at her for a moment. Then he looked around the room. The dusty windows, the worn floor, the 2 walls in the back that would need to come down. What do you want to call it? He said. She'd had the name for a week. She hadn't known it was the name until right now, saying it out loud in this empty building, with the afternoon light coming through the dirty glass and a man standing in it who had walked through 3 days of mountains to be here. Hearth and timber, she said. He said it back to himself quietly, like he was checking how it felt. Yeah, he said. That's right. She nodded. Looked at the room once more. Felt the particular terror of something you've decided, the weight of it settling in. I'm going to talk to the owner tomorrow, she said. I'll go with you. You don't need to eat. I know. He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the windowsill. I'll go with you. She looked at him across the dusty, empty, possible room. Okay, she said. They walked back out into the afternoon and the door swung shut behind them, and Silver Ridge went on around them, and neither of them said much on the walk back because there wasn't much that needed saying. The decision had been made in that room, between them, without ceremony, the way the important decisions usually happened. Not with speeches, but with presence. Not with promises, but with showing up. They would both have to give things up. Rowan would give up the safety of a salary, the infrastructure of someone else's institution. Cade would give up the last pretense of motion as a way of life, the last excuse to call the road freedom and the empty room home. Neither of them knew if it would work. Both of them knew that walking away from it now would be the easier thing and the smaller thing, and neither of them had ever been particularly good at choosing smaller. The wind off the mountains was picking up, cold and direct, the way it always was at the end of a Montana afternoon. They walked into it without breaking stride. The owner of the building on North Main Street was a man named Gerald Pott, who ran the land office 3 doors down and had been trying to rent the empty space since November with the particular frustration of someone who had convinced himself the problem was the market, rather than his asking price. He received Cade and Rowan on a Wednesday morning with the wary optimism of a man who had been disappointed before and was managing his expectations accordingly. He looked at Rowan the way the man at the trading post had looked at her. That second glance, that recalibration. Then he looked at Cade, then back. You're both on the lease? He said. Equal partners, Rowan said. Pott wrote something on his pad. And the business is a restaurant, she said. Hearth and timber. He wrote that down too slowly, like the words were unfamiliar. There's already the hotel dining room. The hotel dining room serves hotel guests and people who can afford hotel prices, Rowan said. I'm talking about a place where anyone in Silver Ridge can walk in and eat well. Ranch hand, banker, school teacher. She looked at him steadily. This town is growing. Growing towns need places where people eat together. That's what we're building. Pott looked at his pad, at his price, at the 2 people across his desk. He came down $15 on the monthly rent. Not as far as Cade had hoped, but far enough that the numbers Rowan had been running in her head for 2 weeks shifted from impossible to merely terrifying. They signed on a Thursday. Rowan gave her notice at the Iron Crest on Friday morning. She did it before service, not to create drama, but because she refused to take Krefft's money for a day's work she'd already mentally left behind. She sat across from him in his office the same way she'd sat across from him on the night of the trial service, and she told him plainly what she was doing and why. Krefft was quiet for a long moment. He looked genuinely unhappy, which was different from what she'd expected. She'd expected calculation. Instead, she got something that looked like a man realizing he'd mismanaged something valuable. "Boss," he said. It wasn't a question. "Partly," she said. "But mostly it's just that I need to build something that's mine. That was always what I was working toward." The Iron Crest was a step, a good one. She meant that. "I learned things here, the service on Friday nights. I'm proud of that work. We'll lose half the Friday covers when word gets out. You'll lose some, but Lily can hold the kitchen. Teach her, give her authority, and she'll hold it." She paused. "If you let Voss undercut her the way he undercut me, you'll lose everything I built inside a month. That's your decision to make." Krefft looked at the window. "I'll handle Voss." "That's between you and him." She stood. "I'd like to finish the morning service if that's acceptable." He nodded. He looked like he wanted to say something else, something about regret, or about what he should have done differently. He didn't say it. Maybe he couldn't find the words. Maybe he'd learned, in the wrong direction, the same lesson Rowan had learned in Denver, that leaving things unsaid until it's too late is its own kind of failure. She went back to her kitchen and cooked the Friday lunch service with the full attention it deserved, every plate as careful as the first plate she'd sent out of that kitchen 8 weeks ago. Lily worked beside her and didn't know yet that this was the last time, and Rowan didn't tell her until the service was done and the kitchen was clean and the aprons were hung. Lily's face when she heard it did the thing faces do when someone young receives news they weren't prepared for, a flash of something unguarded, something close to panic. "What happens to me?" she said. "You run this kitchen," Rowan said. "If Krefft has any sense, which I believe he does when Voss isn't in his ear, he'll make it official." She looked at the girl directly. "And when Hearth and Timber opens, if you want a chair at the table there too, not as prep, not as vegetable work, I'll have a place for you. But you have to want it enough to come and ask for it yourself." Lily looked at her for a long moment. 17 years old, with flour on her sleeve and the beginning of something in her eyes. Not confidence yet, but the seed of it, the first understanding that capability is not the same as permission, and that sometimes you have to decide to take the one in the absence of the other. "I'll ask," Lily said quietly. "I know you will," Rowan said. She walked out the back of the Iron Crest for the last time into the April afternoon, which had finally, grudgingly, started to feel like something other than winter. The work on the building started the following Monday. Cade's carpenter, a broad-shouldered man named August Riley, who'd come to Silver Ridge from Ohio 3 years ago and had been building things ever since with the focused energy of a man who'd decided this was his place and intended to improve it, took down the 2 interior walls in 2 days. He was correct that they weren't load-bearing. He was also correct that the job was not complicated, which did not mean it was fast. The rubble had to go somewhere. The exposed floor had to be leveled. The ceiling needed work where the walls had connected. But by the end of the first week, there was a kitchen space in the back that Rowan stood in and turned around slowly, measuring with her eyes. "The range goes here," she said, pointing. "I want the fire visible from the dining room, so we're not boxing it in. Open on that side." Riley made a note. He'd learned within the first day that Rowan's notes were not suggestions. "The prep station along this wall. Long, not deep. I want people able to move past without collision." She walked the space. "And I need the back door rehung. It sticks. In a real service, that door gets opened 40 times an hour." "I'll rehang it tomorrow," Riley said. "Tonight would be better." He looked at her, looked at Cade, who gave him nothing. Riley rehung the door that evening, and it swung clean. Cade, for his part, had taken on more of the structural and logistical work than either of them had initially planned. He was not a carpenter, but he was a man who understood systems and physical space and the logic of how things needed to work together, and this turned out to translate. He built the bar along the east wall himself, with Riley's guidance, over 4 long evenings, rough-cut pine, solid and honest, not elegant but real, the kind of thing that would still be standing in 30 years. He put it together with the same patient attention he'd given to tracking through snow, methodical, unhurried, willing to take something apart and do it again if the first attempt wasn't right. Rowan found him still working on it at 9 o'clock one Thursday night, shaving the edge of a plank to level it. "You should sleep," she said. "It's not level." "It'll be level enough." He looked up at her. "Do you make that argument about your food?" She paused. "That's different." "Is it?" She sat on an overturned crate and watched him work. The building smelled of fresh-cut wood and sawdust, and the particular potential of a space becoming something. Outside, Silver Ridge had gone quiet. It was a working town, not a saloon town, and most of it was asleep by 9. "I'm scared," she said. She said it the way she said most difficult things, plainly, without dressing it up, like it was just another fact. He kept working. "Of? All of it. The money, mostly. If this doesn't work..." She looked at the half-built bar, the open kitchen space, the dining room floor that Riley had started on but not finished. "You've put in everything you have. So have you. My money was going to be spent on something anyway. I was always going to try to build something." She picked at a piece of sawdust on her knee. "Yours was your safety. 15 years of safety." He set down the plane and looked at her. In the lamplight, he looked like he had in the trapper's cabin, tired in an honest way, not defeated, just real. A person doing difficult work and showing the evidence of it. "My safety was motion," he said, "keeping moving so I didn't have to look at what I was moving away from." He picked the plane up again. "This is the first thing I've built since I was 19, when I helped my father put a barn up, summer before I left." He ran his hand along the bar's edge. "I forgot what it felt like." "What does it feel like?" He thought about it genuinely, which she appreciated. He didn't reach for something easy. "Like the work means something past the moment you finish it," he said. "With tracking, you find the man, or you don't, and either way it's over. The trail doesn't care. The territory doesn't care." He looked at the bar. "This'll be here. People will put their elbows on it." She was quiet for a while. "My father built things too," she said. "Trappers' shelters mostly. Some of them are probably still standing somewhere in Wyoming, and he's been dead 12 years, and I find that..." She stopped. "I find that I think about it sometimes. That he's gone, but the shelters are still there. That something lasts." "That's what you're building," Cade said. "Trying to." "Not trying." He looked at her steadily, the way he had across a dozen campfires. "Building." She held his gaze for a moment, longer than she usually allowed herself. There was a particular kind of knowing that had accumulated between them over 4 months of proximity, of difficult conversations and cold mornings, and the shared weight of a project that scared them both. She'd been aware of it building the way you're aware of weather building. You can see it coming if you're paying attention. You just keep working and let it come when it comes. "Cade," she said. "Yeah, when this opens, when it works..." She stopped, started again. "I'm not good at this part." "I know you're not." He said it without cruelty, just fact. "Neither am I." "Then we're well matched," she said. Her voice was dry, but her eyes weren't. He set the plane down for the second time. He crossed the distance between them. Not quickly, not dramatically, just directly. And he was still dusty from the work, and his hands still smelled like pine sap. And he didn't say anything else, and neither did she. And the building was quiet around them, and Silver Ridge was asleep outside, and that was enough. That was exactly enough. Hearth and Timber opened on a Saturday in May. It was not a smooth opening, nothing real ever is. The range developed a draft problem in its second hour of use that sent smoke into the kitchen in intermittent, eye-watering waves until Riley, who happened to be at a table in the dining room because Rowan had invited everyone who'd worked on the building to eat for free on opening night, diagnosed the flue cap and fixed it from the roof while the kitchen below kept moving. 2 of the 3 tables Rowan had sourced from a carpenter in Billings arrived with uneven legs and had to be shimmied with folded cloth, which was not ideal. A waiter she'd hired, a young man named Percy who'd come to Silver Ridge from somewhere south and had good instincts and terrible handwriting, dropped a full tray in the second hour of service, and the sound of it hitting the floor went through the dining room like a gunshot, and then settled into the particular uncomfortable silence of a room full of people pretending they hadn't flinched. Rowan came out of the kitchen. She came out not to apologize and not to make a speech, but simply to be visible, to stand in the doorway between the kitchen and the dining room and let the room see her. Let them see that the kitchen was still running, that nobody back there had panicked, that the drop tray was a drop tray and not a catastrophe. She looked at the room. 22 people. A cattle buyer she recognized from the hotel dining room. 2 women from the schoolhouse, teachers who'd heard about the opening from someone Rowan didn't know. A rancher named Decker, who worked the spread 15 miles south in his work clothes, hat on the hook by the door, sitting at the bar with his elbows on the pine Cade had built. 3 men who might have been miners or might have been lawyers. In this town, it wasn't always clear. She looked at the rancher at the bar. He had the roughed-up, weathered look of a man who spent more time outdoors than in, and he was eating the braised short rib she'd put on the menu with the focused attention of someone encountering something they hadn't expected. He looked up and caught her eye. "Ma'am," he said, "this is the best thing I've eaten in Silver Ridge." She nodded. "Glad to hear it. What's in the sauce?" "Stock, red wine, juniper, and thyme." She looked at the room once more. "Enjoy your evening." She went back to the kitchen. Percy swept up the broken dishes. The service continued. By 9 o'clock, the dining room had turned twice, and there was a small group waiting on the porch, which she hadn't anticipated and which was both wonderful and a problem she'd need to solve before next Saturday. After the last table left and the kitchen was clean and the front door was locked, Rowan sat at the bar, the imperfect, solid, hand-built bar, and put her face in her hands and didn't cry, exactly, but was in the vicinity of it. Cade sat beside her. He put a glass of water in front of her without being asked. "The flu," she said into her hands. "Fixed. The tables. We'll get them planed properly next week. Percy is 20 years old and he dropped a tray and he went right back to work. He'll be fine." He was quiet for a second. "The rancher at the bar, Decker." She lifted her face from her hands. "What about him?" "He came back in at 8:30. Ate again." Cade looked at the bar top. "Different order. Ate the whole thing. Left a good tip and said he'd be bringing his wife next weekend." She looked at him. "One service," he said. "First service, flu problem, uneven tables, dropped tray. And you had a man come back and eat twice." She was quiet. "I know you know what that means," he said. She did know. She also knew that knowing something intellectually and letting it reach the part of you that needed to hear it were 2 separate operations, and the second one was harder and slower and didn't always happen on schedule. She picked up the water glass and drank it. "We need a better flu cap," she said. "I'll order it Monday." "And the tables?" "Monday. And Percy needs to practice carrying the tray fully loaded before next Saturday, not during—" "Rowan." He said her name the way he said most things, quietly, without performance. "It worked." She looked at him. "It worked tonight," he said. "The food worked. The room worked. People came and they ate, and they were glad they came." He held her gaze. "Everything else is just problems to solve, and you're good at solving problems." She thought about a trapper's cabin in January with 1 wall missing, a pass marked with 3 stones, a campfire in a frozen hollow, and a bowl of stew she'd made from what she had. She'd been solving problems her entire life, in conditions considerably worse than uneven table legs. "Yes," she said. "I am." She leaned against him, not dramatically, just shifted her weight until she was against his shoulder, which was solid and warm and smelled like the pine bar and the long day. He didn't make anything of it. He just stayed where he was. They sat like that in the quiet of the first night, in the building they'd signed for together and rebuilt together and opened tonight together, and let the silence be what it was. The weeks that followed were not easy and were not supposed to be. Word traveled the way. Rowan had always known good food traveled, person to person, in the particular urgent way of people who want to make sure someone they care about doesn't miss something worth having. By the 3rd Saturday, they were turning tables 3 times and she'd hired a second waiter. By the 6th week, Lily had left the Iron Crest and come to ask for the chair Rowan had offered, which she did by showing up at the back door on a Monday morning with her knives wrapped in cloth and her chin up, and Rowan had said yes before she'd finished asking. Voss tried something. Of course he did. He'd lost 2 significant assets in the span of a month, and he was the kind of man who responded to loss with retaliation rather than reflection. He started a quiet campaign of the type he was practiced at. Words in the right ears, suggestions to the right people. That the food at Hearth and Timber was overpriced. That the place hired the wrong kind of staff. That sort of thing. The wrong kind of staff, specifically. And anyone who heard Voss say it understood what wrong kind meant, which was that Rowan had hired Lily and had also hired a young Chinese man named Wei who had come to Silver Ridge with the railroad work and stayed. and who had a way with pastry that Rowan had discovered entirely by accident when she found him making something in the boarding house kitchen at 6 in the morning. She'd tasted it and hired him on the spot. Voss's words reached her. They always did. These things always did. And her response was to put Wei's pastry on the menu with his name beside it. Pastry. Weichin. Not anonymous, not buried. Attributed. Let people know whose hands made what they were eating, because she'd spent enough years being erased from her own work that she intended to make erasure structurally impossible inside anything she ran. The retaliation from Voss's quarter grew louder before it got quieter. There was a period of 3 weeks in July where it was genuinely bad. Some ugliness on the street directed at Wei, a window on the restaurant's side wall broken in the night, a letter sent to Kreft suggesting he should reconsider his association with a business of that character. The letter didn't name Rowan by name. It didn't need to. Kate handled some of this, and she let him, because she understood the difference between needing to fight every battle yourself and needing to choose which ones required her specific presence. He had conversations she wasn't part of, with people she didn't always know about, in the particular quiet way that a man who'd spent 15 years tracking people through difficult terrain was able to make clear that certain behaviors had consequences. He didn't threaten. I was simply present in a way that communicated capacity, which was often enough. It was not enough for the window. She stood in front of the broken window on a Tuesday morning with glass on the inside sill and the street looking in, and she felt the familiar weight of it. The weight of building something in a world that periodically decided to remind you that you weren't supposed to be building. She'd felt it in Denver. She'd felt it her whole life. She was tired of feeling it, and she was not going to stop. She had Riley replace the glass that afternoon. She had him install a second lamp outside the side wall so the space was lit at night. And she stayed open that Friday without discussion, without announcement, without any statement beyond the simple act of opening the doors and cooking the food. The rancher Decker came in that Friday with his wife, as he'd said he would, and he brought 2 other ranchers from the valley who'd heard from him. The school teachers came. A family Rowan didn't recognize, newcomers, just arrived in Silver Ridge, who'd been told by someone at the feed store to eat at Hearth and Timber their first night. The dining room was full. She never found out definitively who broke the window. She had suspicions. She let them remain suspicions because proving it would have required time and energy she needed elsewhere, and because the more important truth was that it hadn't mattered. They'd broken the glass and she'd replaced the glass and kept cooking, which was its own kind of statement. Voss left the Iron Crest in September. She didn't know the full story of why. Silver Ridge was not a small enough town for everything to be known, but she heard from Lily, who still had contacts there, that Kreft had finally had the conversation that should have happened in March. Whatever was said in that conversation, Voss was gone within a week, replaced by a woman named Dora Whitfield, who had managed hotel staff in 3 different cities, and who, by Lily's account, was entirely competent and entirely uninterested in anyone's kitchen politics. Rowan heard this news on a Sunday morning over breakfast, which she and Cade had started eating together at the restaurant before opening because it was easier than going home and coming back, and because home had, sometime in the past several months, without a particular moment she could point to, become wherever he was. She told him about Voss. He poured more coffee. How do you feel about it? She considered that. Like someone turned off a noise I'd been hearing so long I'd stopped noticing it, she said. Relief. And then relief that it's over, which is different. He looked at her across the table, the good table, the one near the window, the one she'd chosen for them on the first morning, and that had been theirs ever since. What's the difference? Relief that the thing is gone. Relief that it's over means I don't have to carry it forward. I don't have to keep one eye on it anymore. She wrapped both hands around her cup. I can just cook. That's all you ever wanted. That's all I ever wanted, she said, simply, like the years of fighting for it hadn't happened, and also like they had, both at once. He reached across the table and covered her hands with his. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was the gesture of 2 people who'd been in the habit of each other for long enough that the gesture was simply part of the habit, the way the table by the window was part of the habit, the way Sunday morning coffee was part of the habit. The ordinary intimacy of a shared life that had been built the way all real things are built. Slowly, with mistakes, from materials you had on hand rather than the ones you wished for. They married that autumn. A small thing. The justice of the peace. 2 witnesses who were Lily and Riley. A dinner after at Hearth and Timber, where Rowan cooked for 12 people, and Wei made a cake that made the justice of the peace say he'd never had better. And Wei said nothing to that, but stood up a little straighter. There was no honeymoon. The restaurant was open 6 days a week, and neither of them had the disposition for extended idleness. They celebrated by opening a second lamp in the front window that people could see from the street. What came after was not the end of difficulty. Anyone who tells you that building something real ends the difficulty is selling you a version of the story with the middle cut out. There were bad winters and slow months and a stretch in the second year when money was tight enough that Rowan did the food costs 3 times on a Sunday night trying to find a number that worked, and Cade sat with her at the table and didn't pretend there was an easy answer and didn't leave the room. There was a fire in the kitchen in the third year. Not catastrophic, but close. A grease fire that took out part of the prep station and cost them 2 weeks of service and money they'd been saving for something else. They rebuilt the prep station better than it had been. Lily became, over time, what Rowan had seen in her from the beginning, a real cook with her own instincts and her own voice, and eventually her own small following of people who came in specifically to eat whatever Lily was making. Rowan watched this happen the way her father must have watched her, she thought, with the particular satisfaction of someone who has passed a thing on and sees it continue past them, which is a different satisfaction from being good at something yourself. Deeper, maybe, more complete. Weishen's pastry became, inexplicably and delightfully, famous across 3 counties. People ordered it specifically. A woman came from Billings on a Wednesday, a 2-day journey, and ate 3 of his desserts and sent a letter afterward that said she'd told everyone she knew. We read the letter in the kitchen carefully and then folded it and put it in his coat pocket and went back to work. Rowan saw him do it. She understood exactly what it meant to tuck something like that away close to the body, to need it to be real before you could afford to let it be real. She didn't say anything about it. She didn't need to. Silver Ridge grew around hearth and timber, the way a town grows around something that becomes essential to it. Not dramatically, but steadily, the way rivers cut channels over time. People who'd lived there for years would tell newcomers to eat at hearth and timber on their first week, because it would tell them something about the town they needed to know. That it was a place where the work mattered more than the person's pedigree. That who you were when you walked in the door was less important than what you ordered, and whether you were decent to the people around you. This was not an accident. It was the restaurant Rowan had described that afternoon in the empty building. Ranch hand next to banker, good food crossing lines that other things couldn't. She'd built it that way on purpose, down to the price points and the table sizes and the single menu that didn't have a cheaper section and a better section. One menu. Everyone eats the same food. Years later, many years, the kind that accumulate before you're ready for them. A young woman came to the restaurant asking to learn. She was 18, from a ranch 40 miles south, and she'd been told by her mother, who'd been coming to hearth and timber since the beginning, that if she wanted to be a cook, she should start here. She stood at the back door on a Monday morning with her chin up and her hands folded, and Rowan recognized the posture immediately. She hired her before the girl finished asking. It was Cade who told the story best, when people asked. He was not a man who sought out conversations, but when someone asked, and people did ask, because the restaurant had the particular quality of making people curious about its origins, he told it straight, without embellishment, in the plain language of someone who was there. He talked about 3 days in the mountains and a campfire in the snow. He talked about a woman who'd built a perfect fire before he'd finished clearing the door, who'd found a pass by 3 stones on a flat rock, who'd cooked stew from scraps in a broken cabin and made it taste like intention. He talked about a dining room going quiet. He talked about an empty building with flour dust on the floor and 2 interior walls that needed to come down. He talked about a bar he'd built himself out of rough pine that was still standing, still had people's elbows on it, exactly the way he'd hoped when he built it. What he didn't say, usually, what he saved for the quiet Sunday mornings at the table by the window, or for the late nights after the kitchen was clean and the town was asleep and the lamp in the front window was still burning, was the part about what it had given him, not the restaurant specifically, not Silver Ridge. What the decision had given him when he'd stopped moving long enough to stay. He'd spent 15 years calling motion freedom and calling the empty room home, and he'd been wrong about both in the particular stubborn way that people are wrong about things they've decided before they had enough information to decide correctly. He wasn't angry about the years. They'd made him what he was, and what he was had been useful, to Rowan, to the restaurant, to the community they'd built inside it. You brought what you'd been to what you became. But there was a difference between a life that kept you moving and a life that meant something when you stopped. He'd found that difference in a broken trapper's cabin in January, eating stew across a fire from a woman who was going to Silver Ridge because she refused to accept the world's definition of her worth. He'd just been smart enough, eventually, to follow. On the last Sunday of every month, Rowan cooked for the staff. Not for guests, not for reputation, just for the people who worked in her kitchen, at the big table in the back that was usually a prep station. She cooked whatever she wanted, which meant she cooked the things that had no practical reason to be on a restaurant menu. The bean soup she'd first made in that trapper's cabin, the potato soup from the Laramie boarding house, the salt pork and corn from the third night in the mountains. Camp food, Cade called it. Privately, between them. She never called it that. She called it what it was. The food that had kept her alive when survival was not guaranteed, made with care in a place where care now had room to grow. Same ingredients, different kitchen. The difference was everything. She cooked and her staff ate, and the restaurant was closed, and Silver Ridge went about its Sunday business outside, and the lamp in the front window burned the way it always did, visible from the street, a simple signal to anyone passing that there was warmth here if you needed it, that someone was awake and working and had not, despite everything the world had offered by way of discouragement, decided to stop. She had never stopped. That was the whole story, really. The rest was just details.